Thank you for being here. I guess where I'll go with this conversation, because we're saving the discussion until later, is to give you a little history of how I came to be here on the stage today. And it really started when I was a toddler, dressed in my cute pink jammies, and being the good empiricist that young people are, I went around and was exploring the world and found a can of lighter fluid on the kitchen table and did what empiricists do, which is to taste it. And that then led me in and out of intensive care and into the arms of the caregivers. And I had weeks of kind of in and out of consciousness and awareness. And I think there were certain seeds that were planted in that moment. And I think that there's a deep reverence that I have for those caregivers, for the doctors and the nurses and the candy stripers and the people who ultimately nourished me back to life. And I think that that may have been the place where I became really aware that consciousness is something very delicate and very beautiful. And I think that even though I don't remember what happened, there was something very powerful that happened in that moment. And then I, as we talked about in the film, grew up in Detroit, and I was very rebellious. I was in a lot of pain as I looked around and saw what was happening in our society. It was a time when there were riots. It was a war that we were engaged in against ourselves. You know, ultimately we saw it as a race war, a class war, a gender war, and ultimately a worldview paradigm war, where there were different models of reality. And having come from Detroit and the automobile industry and sort of the pinnacle of materialism, I was really kind of frustrated and felt impotent to do anything to make change. And I think that led to some acting out behaviors, including that motorcycle accident. So what I learned from that motorcycle accident was two things, really. One is that having that out-of-body experience very vividly gave me a personal testimonial. So I got this sense that consciousness is something that is potent, that it has these capacities to reach out into the world. And then I ended up in the emergency room that night, and they talked about amputating my leg. And they thought, okay, we're going to stitch her up, 66 stitches in my left leg, and sent me home with the prospect that I'd be back, and if it wasn't healing, that they were going to have to do something fairly dramatic. And I remember I had a cast from my hip to my ankle, and I would lay on the couch in my family's living room, and I can't tell you where this insight came from, but somehow I had this idea that if I could harness my imagination and my visual apparatus, that I could rally my immune system in order to heal my leg. And so I would lay there and meditate and feel the tingles going up and down my leg. And sure enough, went back to the hospital to have the cast removed. And while it wasn't, you know, a remarkable recovery, I still have two good legs. And again, I think this was an example for me of how consciousness has these capacities, these powers, in order to heal ourselves, in order to reach out and potentially heal others. So those were things that really catalyzed for me, I think, an interest in these topics before, you know, there was a real intellectual kind of aspect to my curiosity. And then I went to college at Wayne State University in downtown Detroit, and I discovered two books that literally changed my life. And the first was by Thomas Kuhn, called The Structure of Scientific Revolution. And that book said that we live in a paradigm or a worldview, a model of reality, and that those paradigms change over time. So it's not fixed or absolute. And what I was experiencing as a kid growing up in Detroit in this materialist culture wasn't fixed or absolute. And what Kuhn did in his book is to chronicle the development of these paradigm shifts in science. And so he took this sort of bastion of truth, science, and looked at how there have been fundamental shifts in our models of reality over time. And I thought, well, that's amazing and great, because this means that what we're experiencing, what we're living in, isn't fixed or absolute, and that there are these potentials for change. The second book I read was by Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut who's featured in the film. And I hadn't met him at that point, but the book was called Psychic Explorations. And it was filled with essays by leading scientists and philosophers and physicians. And the book said to me that there is a paradigm shift underway, and that this idea of consciousness and the extended reaches of our human potential may be the next great paradigm to tackle. And I thought, well, you know, I always wanted to be a revolutionary. I wanted to make change. So I kind of hitched my wagon to that star and began to pursue an interest in the science of these extended states. And I'd never met Edgar for another 25 years probably when I went to work at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and I never applied for the job. The job came to me and presented itself, and so it was one of those, you know, intuitive hunches that ultimately, you know, felt very right and very appropriate, that I would end up working with him in a very, you know, concerted way. So my first stop was here at Irvine. And I came out to study with a man named Robert Morris. And so I spent my last year of undergraduate work at the University of California, Irvine, and really learned about how one could bring the rigor and discernment of science to these ineffable qualities. And I started doing remote viewing. And I was very interested in how we could test the claims that were being made by Targ and Puthoff to physicists who were working for the DIA-CIA program exploring these capacities, and they'd made claims that anybody could do these kinds of things. And so I was really curious about that. I had started when I was at Wayne State doing some real kind of dabbling, and I was working with an experimental psychologist, Charlie Soley, and he said that, you know, he really wanted to do this kind of research, and so we started with each other. One day Charlie would go out and visit a location and I'd stay in, or vice versa. And we had some remarkable hits where, you know, the quality of what my description was matched, you know, very accurately the location that he'd been in. And then one day we decided to actually do an experiment with a psychic. And so we brought her in, and first of all, I was the outbound person, and she really didn't have much that matched with the location. And so the next time he went out, and I stayed in with her and, you know, asked her some questions about what she was experiencing, what was going on in her mind. And he came back and he asked her impressions, and then he turned to me and he said, well, what did you get? And I said, well, I'm the scientist here. I'm objective. I didn't get anything. And he's like, oh, come on, you must have had something. And I said, okay, well, I just had this little image that came into my mind, and it was like an omega symbol. And he got very excited about that, and we went over to the location on the campus, and he'd been sitting by a building. The building was surrounded by a moat, and the moat was surrounded by a fence. The fence was made up of these omega symbols, and etched in concrete on the side of the building was this big omega symbol. So that seemed like a pretty good hit. And that led me to start really having a curiosity about the experimenter and this notion of objectivity in science. And is it true that we can be completely detached from the object of our inquiry? And again, just a fleeting little idea. So when I ended up at Irvine, I was doing a study on remote viewing with unselected people. We picked students and people from the community to come in and do the experiment. And it was my first publication, and we found significant support for the remote viewing hypothesis. And as it turns out, years later, when I came to be friends with Targ and Puthoff, they told me that that paper ended up saving their program because it showed that there was a person outside of their community, outside of the Defense Department and the CIA, that had actually shown that this kind of phenomenon was possible. And so the government sponsors found that this was something that they needed evidence in order to continue to sustain the program, which lasted for 20 years at SRI and SAIC. So from there, I was telling my friend last night the story of driving, because I was living in Redondo Beach and coming to Irvine, and all the traffic and all the freeways of LA, which you guys know. And I was speeding, and I got pulled over, and I burst into tears. And I was just beside myself, you know, and this police officer gave me the ticket. And I thought, gee, you know, I would really like to leave here. And I had applied to the LA Art School and the Institute for Parapsychology in Durham, North Carolina. And I thought, okay, this is my chance to leave. And so I went to North Carolina, spent 3 years doing research on remote viewing, on psychic healing, on the experimenter effect. And all of that was just divine. It was a wonderful experience to kind of grow up and be every day in a research laboratory, working with these amazing people, having these direct personal experiences. One of the experiments that we did is now considered a classic, where I was the remote viewer, and there was a colleague of mine in Rome, Italy, and he created a target pool of 40 different locations in Rome, and each of 10 days randomly selected one of those places to visit. And so at the same time, every day, we agreed to meet in psychic space, and I would draw my experiences, and he would then, you know, document what was going on at the site while he was there. We then gave all of that material to 5 independent people who were not part of the experiment, didn't know which location matched which of the transcripts of imagery. And we found that we got 6 direct hits out of 10 with a P of 1 in 10. So it ended up being a very strong statistical documentation of the remote viewing phenomenon, and actually the strongest result in the literature. And again, something that helps support the SRI program. I got really interested about that time in, you know, this idea of consciousness as something more than something we're going to study in the laboratory. I mean, one of the things that happens in these experiments is that you are looking at a probability outcome. And so all of those rich experiences of what was going on in my head or his head were reduced to a number. And that's great. If the number is the number you're looking for, it's fine. But it wasn't really the essence of consciousness for me. And it also didn't have the kind of practical application that I really wanted. And so I started looking at these claims made by healers all over the world that they could harness their intention in a way that reached out and affected other people, even when that other distant person had no idea that it was happening. So we started with mice. That was my only animal study that I've ever done, and I will never do another one again. But we took these mice, we paired them for weight and gender, age, and we put them on photocells. And there were video cameras on top of the photocells, and a random generator would turn one of the cameras on or not. So there was a closed circuit television, and we brought in healers, doctors, nurses, and ourselves to view the mouse that was randomly selected to be the object of our intention. And what we were able to measure is the resuscitation rate of these anesthetized mice. So they're on these photocells, and they're waking up. And the goal was to see if we could wake up the experimental mouse faster than the control mouse. And in fact, we did that. And we were able to demonstrate that there was some kind of intention. And the people who performed the best in these experiments were the experimenters, which was interesting. So that led to my trying to find who was doing the greatest research in the world on this kind of topic. And I found William Broad, who was a physiological psychologist at a place called the Mind Science Foundation in San Antonio, Texas. And the Mind Science Foundation had been set up by a man named Tom Slick, who was an oil tycoon. Slick, oil. And he made a lot of money, and he founded a couple of big foundations that are biomedical in nature. And then he decided that he wanted to leave a large endowment to this little foundation that he'd created to study these exceptional experiences. So he knew exactly what he was doing, and in fact, he died during a trip in the Himalayas looking for the abominable snowman. So he was quite an explorer and an adventurer, and he, his son inherited the vision for this and really kind of shifted it from table tilting and spoon bending to a rigorous scientific program. And William was doing this work on psychic healing, and so he and I developed a protocol that would allow us to take these claims made by these healers, and instead of working with animals, we were working with humans. So we would measure the physiology of a person who came into the lab, in particular their autonomic nervous system activity, that part of our physiology that functions automatically. We don't have to think about our heart beating in order for it to beat, which is a good thing because we wouldn't get much done if we were thinking about it all the time. And so what we did is to have a person in one room measuring their physiology and another person in another room watching a chart recorder of that physiology. And the idea was that at random times throughout the session, the person would direct their intention toward the distant person, and at other times they would do nothing. And so this allowed us a within-subject comparison of the average amount of physiological activity during the intentionality periods as compared to the control periods. And we did 14 formal experiments looking at a variety of different questions and found highly statistically significant differences when someone was aiming toward the distant person as compared to when it was just a neutral intention. And again, the experimenters ended up having the strongest results of anyone, which was, again, interesting because it begins to really challenge that fundamental cornerstone assumption we make in science of an objective world out there that we can somehow manipulate. It begins to really look like there's much more of an entangled relationship between intention, consciousness, and the physical world. So I stayed there for 10 years. At the same time, I started to get a strong passion and interest in, again, this idea of the lived experience of consciousness. And I still wanted to do rigorous, careful research, but I wanted to really understand the fullness of what people were going through, and in particular, these healers. And so I got into an anthropology program and ended up working my way through to a Ph.D. in medical anthropology. And at the same time, I was working in the lab. So I was able to balance going out and doing field work with healers, talking to them and experiencing with them what their lives were like and what their methods were like. How did they approach this idea of healing, and particularly at a distance? And so I did that, and then it was clear that the research at the Mind Science Foundation was not going to continue. They had decided that they wanted to phase out this kind of renegade research and instead wanted to go toward, brain mapping and some very conventional kind of neuroscience research, which was a shame because we really did have the most powerful, potent research lab in the world at that point. A lot of fun. So I had to think about, what was I going to do next? And somebody at a conference asked me, and I said, well, I don't know, but whatever it is, I hope I can't envision it from this vantage point. So cut to 2 weeks later, I was called by Ed May, who was one of the physicists who'd been part of that whole SRI remote viewing program. And I said, how's your lovely wife? And he said, well, my lovely wife thinks I should hire you. And I said, okay, well, that's nice. So I ended up getting security clearance and working for the DIA CIA program. And that was really interesting. I got to learn a lot about what had been happening in closed file drawers. And it was also something that now has largely been declassified. So most of that information is available to the general public. But I wasn't really sure I wanted to leave Texas and work for the government. And so I knew that there was an endowed position at Stanford. And it was founded by Thomas Welton Stanford, who's the brother of Leland. Leland started Stanford University, and his brother it's his youngest brother, as it turns out. I just went to one of the museums on Stanford campus, and they had a nice little historical exhibit around what that family was like and what they were doing. And what happened with Thomas Welton is that he had been engaged to be married, and his fiancée died. And he was in such a state of grief that he just wanted to leave. And he took a ship and went to Australia. And he got so seasick on the trip that he never wanted to get on a boat again. So he was never coming back. But he decided to leave his money to his brother's little college. And it was to study psychical research. And he was in particular interested in seances and the idea of mediumship and whether there could be these kinds of communications between the departed and the living world. And they didn't like that idea particularly. So they sent a team of lawyers over on a ship. I don't know if they got seasick. They had no choice but to come back. And they kind of persuaded him that psychical research and psychology are kind of the same thing. And he was clever enough to realize that wasn't exactly the truth. So he earmarked a small pool of his money specifically for the study of psychic phenomena. And meanwhile, a lot of the money that he left went into the psychology department, which is why Stanford now has the #1 psychology program in the country, and because they were able to hire faculty that were, world class. Well, so I decided that there's a lot of politics in this thing, and there's a lot of prejudice against these kinds of phenomena, even when you have a dedicated fund that is the purpose is very clearly earmarked. The same thing with the Mind Science Foundation. Tom Slick was very clear about what he wanted to do, but future generations have different thoughts about it. So what happened is that I was aware that this fund existed, but I knew that they were very unlikely to fund me to prove the existence of psi. So instead, I kind of picked up on what I'd done for my dissertation, and I did a linguistics analysis of the skeptic-proponent debate in parapsychology, looking at the nature of truth construction in science. So we think that science is this objective inquiry and that it is a vehicle for truth. But what you find is there's a huge amount of subjectivity in how one decides what's true. And this idea has stayed with me ever since. But one of the things we found is, I interviewed skeptics, I interviewed proponents, and I talked to them about why do you believe what you believe? And of course, people referred to the objective it. The data was there or it wasn't. And yet, when you really started to talk to them about what shifted their worldview, their paradigm, as it were, it came down to a first-person pronoun. I had an experience, or somebody I respect and know had an experience. So it was this first-person introspective aspect that really shifts our capacity to believe something or not, and that you can amass as much objective data as you want, and if people are already supportive of the idea, they will buy into that, and if they're not, they won't. And I think you've got Jessica Utz coming in a couple of months, and she will talk to you about the whole nature of statistics and how it is that it's much more effective to look at things like Bayesian statistics, which are grounded in the fact that I have a priori beliefs, and that then allows me to decide what is the threshold of truth. Anyway, so I was working at Stanford. I had this wonderful postdoc. I got the job. I also had this fellowship with Ed at the Science Applications International Corporation. And what we did there was actually the more evidential work. So he asked me to do a set of experiments. I worked with Stephen LaBerge, who's known for his work on lucid dreaming. And we looked at whether people could detect someone staring at them from a distance. And so again, we used the autonomic nervous system as a dependent variable. We brought in some of the SRI, star players, and some people who weren't. And what we were able to do is take a closed circuit television, just like the experiment I did with the mice all those years back. I never thought about it until after, that we were kind of doing the same idea. But we would have a video camera pointed at a person, and that video camera would go on and off based on a random schedule. So there would be a person in a distant room who was watching the image of the other person via closed circuit television, and when they saw the image, they would stare intently, and when they didn't, they would just go to a neutral intention. Non-intention, really. And so we found in both experiments that we had significant differences in the physiological activity when the person was being stared at as compared to the control conditions. And this was an experiment that allowed us to look at, was it heightened peripheral vision, when you're driving in your car and you just get this sense that somebody's looking at you. That could be that you're just picking up some motion change with your peripheral vision. So in this experiment, we were able to eliminate that as a potential explanation. About that time, I got the phone call at the Institute of Noetic Sciences that said, we would really like you to come here and be our director of research. And that was just the wonderful synchronicity of life that Edgar Mitchell had founded this organization, that I had read his book and that had sent me on my odyssey, and now I was being invited to come there and work. And I stayed there for 25 years, graduated through various stages of leadership, and ultimately ended up as the president and CEO, which wasn't as much fun as being the research director, I will tell you. So while that all was happening, I had a colleague. His name is Richard Wiseman. He is a professor of psychology. He is a magician, and he's a card-carrying member of the skeptical community. And he's over in England doing these same experiments, these remote staring studies. And he had done the same work I had done, only getting the opposite results. He wasn't finding anything, and I think he ultimately decided that there was something going on with me, and he wasn't quite sure, so he invited me over to his lab. And we had a camera crew there. It was like NBC or one of these programs, and we ended up getting, remarkably different results. So I worked with some people and he worked with some people, and we both replicated our original findings. So I got a significant difference and he didn't. So we decided we should take this more seriously, and we ultimately ended up doing 3 studies together over a period of 10 years. And we, in the first 2 studies, both of us replicated our original findings. So I was batting 4 for naught in a positive direction, and he was batting 4 for naught in the negative direction. And again, so this leads me to think about the experimenter effect and this idea of objectivity. The final study that we did together just became grueling, and it was so boring to me that we ended up calling off the study early. And we did get some interesting interactions, but it didn't ultimately have the same magnitude of effect that we found in the earlier work. Still, if you put it all together, very strong, significant differences. So it provides a kind of proof of principle that when people make these claims that they're able to influence somebody's physiology at a distance, that may in fact be so. That led to some clinical trials. We talked about Elizabeth Targ in the film a little bit. There were a number of studies done for a very short period of time looking at whether this kind of psychic healing or prayer or intention could influence clinical outcomes. So Elizabeth looked at HIV. There were several studies that looked at heart disease. A number of different questions were considered, and the results ended up being, at first, very suggestive, very positive, and then ultimately very ambiguous. You can always dig and find something that correlated, but ultimately it just doesn't feel like a very robust direction. And I think that's largely due to the fact that there's so many variables going on when somebody's in a medical situation that you just don't really know. And I think one of the problems was the link between the prayers and the patients, and you didn't know whether there was an alignment between their worldviews, their belief systems, their intentions. So I have kind of backed away from doing any clinical work. It's just really difficult and very hard to recruit patients and so on. So that area has kind of reached a hiatus, and I don't really know of anybody in the world right now doing that kind of work. I am currently doing an experiment. So I left the Institute of Noetic Sciences, made this film with Deepak, spent 3 years. I've also got a book that is it's not the same as the film by any means, but it's a nice companion. Deepak thought we should call it the same title. I think that could have been a little bit of a mistake because people think it's just the transcript of the movie or something, and it's not. But so I spent some time doing that and creating educational programs. And there's a number of things on the Death Makes Life Possible website for people nurses, doctors, anybody with an interest in these kinds of things. And one of the things, for example, is that for nurses and doctors, they're really not taught how to have the conversation about death. It's heroic measures. And so we were really trying to help appease that vacuum in the field and give some skill sets to the health professionals. And this movie now has been translated into, I think, 7 languages. It's been all over the world. Right now it's being translated into Japanese, and they're taking all of our educational materials. There's a 10-part program around it, and they are translating that into Japanese so that they can take it all over the country of Japan. So that's exciting. I've got a person who was going over today, actually, to Japan to work with them on that. And we ended up on Oprah. That was exciting. And so, it has made an impact. I think it's had millions of views. And yet, at the same time, it's done now. And it's time to kind of move on and figure out what comes next. And one of the things I found is that I was trying to create some educational programs in retirement communities. And I ended up getting a wonderful relationship with the largest chain of retirement communities in the country. And the guy was super supportive. Our people really need to think about this. And then somebody in the marketing department discovered the word death in the title, and it killed it. It was done. And they said that wasn't their marketing message, and they really didn't want to go out that way. So I pivoted. And in that weekend, I thought, okay, aging. Nobody can deny aging. We're going to do that. So, and then it turns out that I created this wonderful program. They piloted it in several places and then really decided it wasn't Christian enough. So, and as you can see, we really did try to sample from a diverse range of traditions and philosophies. So I have been continuing to do the work on aging. I've got a book in preparation. We've created a couple of training programs around grateful aging is what we call it. And right now, I just completed yesterday 2 grant proposals that I'll tell you about the projects. One is on aging, and it's called the counterclockwise effect. So there's a woman named Ellen Langer. I bet a lot of you have heard of her study, even though you might not recognize her name. She did this now classic experiment where she took men who were in their 70s into a house that had been decorated to be 20 years earlier. So everything, the TV shows, the magazines, the radio, the furniture, everything simulated the environment 20 years earlier. And she was able to measure physiological and psychological changes and found significant, highly significant differences in the before and after measures, and then compared it with men who were asked to reminisce about the past versus living in the past. And that also produced significant differences. So there's something about the worldview, the paradigm, the belief system, and her thing is mindfulness, long before that was a trendy topic. And she is really interested in how society gives us all of these cues about what to expect and what happens in that process of aging. And what she found is if you can begin to change people's expectancies, you have the potential to be able to change the biology and the psychology. Well, this project, strangely enough, has never been replicated. And so the project we just are submitting to a foundation in Portugal is looking at virtual reality. And so the idea is, rather than having to create a whole house, which is part of the reason I think it's never been replicated, it's really a lot of work to do that. But so we're creating little apps in the virtual world that will allow people to go back in time. And so that's going to be the next experiment, and I think that'll be a nice cornerstone for the aging project, particularly if we can find something in it. The second study that we just proposed is based on an idea that comes out of the ancient Greek tradition, where they would go to the oracle, and the oracle would do like a dowsing, where they would try to get information. And the way they did it is that they would stare at a reflective pond or some kind of reflective surface. And as you're staring at this reflective surface, not looking at your own image, but looking at just whatever shows up in the reflection, people start to hallucinate. They start to see images. Your brain is wired to see the sensory world, and when there's no input, the brain makes it up. Sort of. That's one way of thinking about it, or maybe not. So Raymond Moody learned about this, and you think about like polishing the vessel and a genie pops out. It's the same kind of principle. There was something about these reflective surfaces that was across a variety of different cultures and traditions. So he decided to create an experimental paradigm in the lab that would simulate that. So he called it the psychomantium. And basically you would be in a small room, completely dark, except for a mirror that's above your visual perception. So it's kind of tilted toward the ceiling. And there's a very gentle light, a source of illumination on the mirror. And what happens in that situation is that people start having experiences of their departed loved ones, or they have sensations of some kind of spirit coming into their orbit. And so it became a very useful tool for bereavement and grief. People could have those final conversations with the person that they were never able to have when that person was still alive. Arthur Hastings was at the Sophia University Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, where I now work, and he had done these experiments with hundreds of people, and again found that the bereavement experience was vastly improved as a result of the psychomantium experience, and that it correlated with the intensity of the experiences people were having. So again, we're using virtual reality as a way of engaging people in this psychomantium idea and comparing the two, the room, the physical room, with then the virtual experience that people are having. So now I teach at Sophia. I teach Ph.D. students, and we have a master's program, bachelor's program. So it's really fun for me to be able to work with all these smart, interesting, excited people, and to begin to really think about how to scale some of these ideas so that it's not just, in a little room in a laboratory, but something that, these people are psychology majors, and so how can they bring some of these transpersonal experiences into their profession and into their clinical practices. So that's kind of, and then an experiment that I'm doing right now that is about the experimenter effect. So, and anybody who would be interested in participating in this experiment, we're looking for experimenters. And so this is the third in a series that we're doing, where we have recruited people from all over the world to recruit people to be their subjects in an experiment. So this allows us to then look at a very large pool of experimenters. And first we looked at their belief. Secondly, we primed their belief. And now we are doing a embedded task where the idea being that if people are asked what they believe, they often don't quite know. Or they have a kind of a supposition, but there are these unconscious beliefs that happen for people. And so we're now looking to see if we can get at their core unconscious belief system in a way that would allow us to see if there's a correlation between what the experimenter is experiencing and what the outcomes are of their studies. So it kind of goes full circle, and I don't know quite how that all happened, but it did, and so that's been fun. And we are looking for experimenters, and I think your name gets on a publication, that kind of thing. So, what else to say? Well, I think we could open up for conversation now and see, what people want to talk about.